The Hyundai Ioniq 5 is a little bit like this jacket that I'm wearing. It's a little bit bigger than anticipated, makes me look pretty stylish, at least in my opinion, and it's also pretty spenny. Indeed, the Ioniq 5 comes in at roughly £37,000. Want the all-wheel drive variant instead of the rear-wheel drive variant, you're going to be looking to spend around £45,000. Now you can find a detailed breakdown of the different trim levels down on our website below, and of course if you've got any questions, do pop them down in the comment section below. So let's kick things off and talk about that exterior design, shall we? Because here, the Ioniq 5 really does stand out in comparison to the rest of the crowd. In my opinion, it's somewhat reminiscent of the Honda E, except the Ioniq 5 is slightly larger, to say the least. Here it's got a wheelbase of around 3 meters. It actually is around 4.6 meters long, and including the mirrors is around 2.1 meters wide. That's pretty large in my opinion, and actually sits in terms of the larger scale of EVs or vehicles out there on the market. As for its side profile, it does have built-in door handles, and in my opinion, Hyundai have approached this in a pretty good way, whereby when the car is locked or when you're driving, they're concealed within the door and therefore improves aerodynamic efficiency, and when it's unlocked, they're already propped open, making it quite easy to access, whereas with the Tesla Model 3, you have to kind of use a slightly awkward technique. Nevertheless, when it comes to its exterior design, it's available in 9 different colour finishes. The white finish that we've got over here is around £300 option. You can find ones that vary from £500 to £600 odd, and in terms of its stock configuration, it's available in a brown finish. So what about when it comes to its interior? Well, here subjectively, yet again, I really do love the Ioniq 5, although the choice of certain materials around the cabin don't feel as premium. Now when it comes to the technology, you've got two 12.3-inch displays planted at the centre and towards the instrument cluster, of course, and here the one by the instrument cluster is plenty vivid, provides all the key information that you need, and if you want to bolster the experience, you'll have to go for the ultimate trim like we have on review, and here you've got a head-up display with augmented reality, which just bolsters the overall experience. Now moving back to our attention towards the centre display, as in the infotainment system, here it's slightly a shame not to see it actually slightly angled towards driver, which makes kind of usability a little bit easier. Elsewhere here you've got Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which are supported, although the latter when tested doesn't fully utilise the entire width of the 12.3-inch display, and therefore means a third of the display is completely rendered useless, which is really a shame. It's the same that could have been said about other Hyundai vehicles that I've previously reviewed. Nevertheless, the screen itself supports multi-touch input and is very responsive. I had no problems whatsoever in this department. Here it should be also said that you can play around with your audio settings, and for those who are subscribed, you know I do dedicated audio reviews of every vehicle that I review, and as such there's one for the Ioniq 5. It'll be up on your pop banner, down the description below, or indeed in the pinned comments. We'll say in a nutshell, with the ultimate trim that has the Bose 7+1 sound system inside, I was left a little bit disappointed, specifically when I was comparing it to the likes of the Polestar 2 or the Tesla Model 3. Now for you to interact with your media, you do have those physical buttons on the steering wheel, and you also have a physical volume knob which can be found around the dashboard. There's also another set of buttons which are quick access buttons to certain settings on the infotainment system, and just below that you've got dedicated climate controls, although these are touch-based input instead, and it would have been nice to see physical buttons here in this place. Now on the subject of interacting with your Ioniq 5, there is a gear selector found on the right hand side of the steering wheel, which might catch a few people by surprise, but it actually is pretty intuitive once you get your head around it. Elsewhere there's some flappy paddles to adjust the regenerative braking, and we'll touch upon this further down in this review. Now this actually perfectly leads me on to the storage capacity found within the cabin, and here it's absolutely plentiful. It's class leading in some respect because there's plenty of room for you to move around your feet and or to place your goods. Towards the center console, for example, you've got a large storage compartment which is open, although that might be a little bit annoying for those people who want to store away goods from prying eyes, but nevertheless you do have space over here for, let's say, a large size purse or wallet. You've got a wireless charging pad which comes as standard on every Ioniq 5 trim. You've then got a storage compartment found within the center console armrest. You've then got 2 cup holders, and just towards the dashboard, just underneath it that is, you've then got a little storage compartment for, let's say, a smartphone, because if you want to plug it in for, let's say, Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, you'll have to use this USB slot that's found over here, and for additional charge you've then got the 12-volt socket as well. Elsewhere the door bins are plenty large, specifically the ones at the front, whereby they'll fit a 500ml bottle with ease alongside loose change or, let's say, a smartphone. You've then got the glove compartment as well. As for the rear of the cabin, it's also pretty spacious, and you've also got a pull down compartment which also reveals 2 cup holders. Now what really stands out for me when it comes to storage is in terms of its boot capacity. Now to access it on the premium or ultimate trims, you've got a smart electric tailgate, and therefore you've got a button found within the cabin, you've got a button found on your remote, and then you've also got a button found just above the number plate. When you press it, you get this beeping sound, or indeed when you operate it electronically. There's also a button found within the boot lid itself in order to bring down the tailgate. Now, the tailgate itself is really nice in terms of the design. It's got that hatchback design, and therefore as someone who's just under 6 foot, I've got no issues whatsoever when it comes to loading in and out goods, which isn't the same thing that you could say about, let's say, the Tesla Model 3. Now, as for its capacity, it's absolutely class leading. It beats pretty much all of its competitors. Now, with the seats propped up, you have got a whopping 527 litres, and with them popped down, you've got 1,587 litres. Now, that's bigger than most of its competitors, and even competes with the likes of the VW ID4 SUV, whereby it's only beaten by the likes of the Skoda Enyaq iV or the Audi e-tron SUV. Now, this means you've got plenty of room to play around with, and even the rear seats can be brought forwards a little bit in order to reveal a little bit of extra space. Elsewhere, the rear seats do also fold flat, which is also nice to see, making the ability to take elongated goods a breeze, but it should be mindful that you've got a 60-40 split only, so you don't have an integrated ski latch. Elsewhere, when it comes to underfloor compartment storage space, you do have some, so therefore you can stow away, let's say, your charging cables, and at the front of the vehicle you do also have some front storage space, although in the all-wheel drive variant that we've got on review, it's pretty limited. Although if you go for the rear-wheel drive variant, this storage space increases ever so slightly. Now, moving back inside the cabin, I should also talk about the seat comfort, and here the 4 main seats are plenty soft. The rear middle one is unsurprisingly a little bit stiffer. As for headroom at the rear of the cabin, it's a little bit limited, although as someone who's 6 foot, I don't have a problem, but if you were 6'4", 6'7", you might find you're a little bit more crammed in. But that said, there's plenty of legroom to play around with, and so much so that you can really extend your legs, and even the fact that you've got reclining seats at the rear means that you can potentially have a little bit of extra legroom, specifically if you are quite tall. As for the front seats, they are manually adjustable, unfortunately, in the SE Connect, but if you want the electronic seats and you wanted heated front seats plus a heated steering wheel, you'll have to go for the premium or ultimate trims. Just a little note over here, the heated rear seats are only available in the ultimate trim, and that's only the 2 main rear seats, as the middle rear seat isn't heated, unlike you'd find on, let's say, the Tesla Model 3. Now, speaking of which, here there is no panoramic glass roof, which is really a shame. There's not even an option, as far as I'm aware, to add it in, and therefore it means that if you're going to be reclining all the way back in the front seats like you'd find on, let's say, the ultimate trim that we have on review, it means you're going to be gazing into, well, pretty much the lining of the roof of the vehicle, rather than looking into the stars or whatever it might be that you're looking above the car. And this is a factor that I really love in the Tesla Model 3 and the Polestar 2, and it's a shame not to see it featured on the Ioniq 5. But of course, that's quite subjective, so I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts in terms of the panoramic glass roof. Would you have liked Hyundai to actually include it, or do you really not care too much about it? And now we get on to driving comfort, and first off I have to quickly reference cabin noise, and here the Ioniq 5 is actually pretty well insulated from the world around. If you want some more detail about this, by the way, do check out our dedicated audio review. Now, elsewhere there's 2 things I should point out, and here there is a little bit of rattle which appears towards the passenger door frame. I noticed this specifically when you're driving at speed, and also at the rear you have got the back headrest, and these also kind of wobble a little bit. Again, did throw me off specifically when I was driving on more challenging roads or rougher terrain, as I mentioned. Now, moving swiftly on, I should also talk about visibility, and there's another small thing that I should point out, is that the Ioniq 5 doesn't have a rear wiper. Now, that might seem quite trivial to a lot of people, because there's many cars out there which don't have it, but in this respect I did notice that a little bit of dirt which gets collected with the Ioniq 5 ends up being on your rear window, and therefore the only way to clean it is actually to manually clean it off. Elsewhere, the rear view camera on the ultimate trim that we've got also does get pretty dirty, and there's no little wiper to clean off the dirt, and therefore again you're going to have to clean off the muck off that rear view camera if you're going to be wanting to use it when you're reversing. Now, this perfectly leads me on to the visibility elsewhere, because at the side it's absolutely faultless, and at the front it's perfect as well. The A-pillars are pretty small as well, which means that it's very easy to peer around your corners, where the same couldn't be said about, let's say, the Tesla Model 3, which has slightly larger A-pillars. Also, on the ultimate trim you do get blind spot spot monitoring system, and I must say it's absolutely fantastic. Specifically when you're putting on the indicator, you get the little bit of a camera on your instrument cluster. It gives you a little bit of indication as to if there is a vehicle approaching. Other than the actual audible warning, you can actually see it using cameras, and I just think that's a great inclusion. I would love to see that with every single vehicle that's produced in the future. So let's get on and drive, and what I will say over here is that the vehicle itself does perform pretty well, because we're going to talk about handling first, because it does lead us on from the driving comfort. Now here, the vehicle itself is actually pretty well held around corners, despite it being pretty large and also a little bit heavy given the size of the battery pack that we have on review on the AWD model. I had no problems whatsoever with body roll. Yes, there is a little bit of body roll, specifically when you're comparing with the likes of, let's say, the Polestar 2 with even the performance pack on top. However, when you are looking at other EVs out there on the market, such as the hatchbacks designs, such as, let's say, the Renault Zoe or Nissan Leaf, then here the vehicle does a far better job at holding itself around the ground. Now, I should also mention in terms of its suspension setup. Now here, the suspension setup is actually done pretty well. Again, that's to do with the stiffness of the vehicle, and it means that the car itself does feel pretty well, again, when you're going on a little bit of rougher terrain, and equally when you are going on challenging roads which are a little bit more windy and a little bit more fun to drive on. Now, it should be mindful that the comments I'm making over here are about the all-wheel drive system AWD model, and here in comparison you will find that the rear-wheel drive system, the RWD model, will perform a little bit different, because, well, naturally it doesn't have an extra motor at the front of the vehicle. So of course it's just worth bearing that all in mind, but ultimately what I'm trying to say is that the car will still feel pretty good when you are driving it. Now, moving swiftly on, this also does bring me to the driver's feel, because in comparison to its competitors, the VW ID3, the Polestar 2 and the Tesla Model 3, the Ioniq 5 doesn't give you that same one-to-one driver's feel. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not bad, far from it. The Ioniq 5 does feel really fun to drive, and with that power that you have, which we're going to talk about very shortly, it really makes you, well, gives you a lot of sense of joy. However, it's worth considering that the Ioniq 5 just doesn't feel as connected, and I think here it's to do with its steering input, and that is even in its sport mode, where it stiffens up the steering wheel and also stiffens up and, well, makes the accelerator pedal all that bit more responsive, because here in the normal and the eco modes it will feel a lot more mushy and the steering wheel will become a lot lighter. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that the Ioniq 5 is not bad when it comes to driver's feel, but is not quite up to scratch in comparison to its main competitors. And so what about when it comes to its raw performance? And as I did reference, we have the AWD model here, and that dispatches 225 kilowatts of power. That equates to around 301 horsepower, and that dispatches 605 newton meters of torque. From 0 to 60 miles an hour, I had it tested in 4.87 seconds. It is extremely rapid, although not as rapid as the equivalent all-wheel drive variants of the Polestar 2 and the Tesla Model 3, but it's still plenty fast, to say the least. Now, you do have other models to consider. You do have the smaller battery pack variants and also the single rear mounted variants, which do alter in power. Let's say in its smallest configuration you've got 125 kilowatts of power, that equates to 168 horsepower, and in the bigger battery pack rear wheel drive system you've got 160 kilowatts, and that equates to 214 horsepower. They dispatch around 350 newton meters of torque. Now, no matter which Ioniq model you go for, you will be pleased to know that you can get a top speed of 115 miles an hour. When I say pleased to know, that it's going to suffice for a lot of individuals out there, but for those people who live on the German Autobahn, here the Tesla Model 3 really does reign supreme, whereby you can get over 140 to 160 miles an hour as a top speed figure. Now, with performance out of the way, what about when it comes to range? Now here, the Ioniq 5 has two battery pack sizes to choose from. The 58 kilowatt hour battery pack, which is the smaller out of the two, which gets you around 270 miles on the WLTP cycle using the Ultimate trim as a reference. And then if you want the larger battery pack AWD Ultimate model, because it seems like it differs between the Premium and then of course the SE Connect, here the model that we have on review is claimed to get around 250 to 260 miles on the WLTP cycle. Now, what I will say here is, when it comes to efficiency, Hyundai weren't lying to me when they said it is a pretty efficient EV, because I netted 230 to 250 miles in my mixed driving test, which is a pretty solid figure. Although one should consider over here, you are comparing this to the rear wheel drive smaller battery pack variant of the Tesla Model 3, and or the Polestar 2 without its heat pump. What I'm trying to say over here is that if you compare this model, as in the Ioniq 5, with the long-range AWD model from Tesla, which nets around 310 miles, or the Polestar 2 with a heat pack, which will probably net around 250 miles, it means that the Ioniq 5 is actually somewhat outclassed yet again in this department. Even the VW ID.3 gets around 230 miles, which means that the Ioniq 5's 230 to 250 miles range is not as impressive. Now, of course, you can net more range if you go for the rear-wheel drive larger battery pack configuration, and here Hyundai claim that you're going to get around just shy of 300 miles. I can't say that for my own test, but say if it's around 300 miles claimed, you're going to be netting roughly 270 to 280 miles at the very most, and again still means that the Tesla Model 3 still outclasses the Ioniq 5 in this department. And now we get onto regenerative braking, and here I absolutely love what Hyundai have done. See, they've integrated iPedal mode, which is the effective equivalent of e-pedal that you'd find on a Nissan, or for example a full one-pedal driving approach like you'd find on the Polestar 2, or let's say the Tesla Model 3. Now, this doesn't mean that they've completely ignored other settings that they previously had, let's say on the Kia e-Niro, the Kia Soul EV, or the Hyundai Kona Electric, all of which I've previously reviewed, had variety of different regenerative braking modes that you could select from. And well, Hyundai have maintained that in the Ioniq 5, and I absolutely love that, because it just gives you that customization that people just like to have, rather than having a singular one pedal driving approach and or a B mode or just a regular driving mode. So let me just showcase that. Now, right now we're running on level 2 mode, and this is the manual modes that you can select through the flappy paddles. If I shift right, almost the car feels like it's speeding up because it's not recouping energy, and now it's on level 0, which is effectively recouping no energy because it's just coasting. Now, if I go to level 3 mode, the next mode that comes after that is the iPedal mode, and you'll hear a little sound cue. That little sound cue tells me iPedal is on, and suddenly the car starts decelerating at a much more rapid rate. In fact, I'm driving 19 miles an hour. I just lift off completely from my accelerator pedal, and you can see I've pretty much come to a complete standstill in a very short space of time. And I just really love that, because when it comes to inner city commutes like we're doing now, it means that one pedal driving is truly applicable and something that you can do. Now, there is another mode that I should talk about, and that is auto mode. So if you hold down on, let's say, the right flappy paddle, you go on to auto mode. So what is auto mode? Well, auto mode allows you to customize it through the infotainment system. So if I were to go through the infotainment system and select the right mode, so in other words, the strongest regenerative braking mode, the Hyundai Ioniq 5 will remember that I quite like the harshest mode, so therefore when this user is going on auto mode, it means that I should be going on the harshest regenerative braking mode. And that to me is again another testament to how Hyundai have added the customization of regenerative braking. Now, in auto mode, you can also bring the car to a complete standstill. It's worth bearing that in mind, because this was very much present in the Kia e-Niro and Hyundai Kona Electric, that if you do want to bring the car to a complete standstill, harshest regenerative braking mode will effectively keep you rolling. If you want to come to a standstill, you hold down on the left paddle, and it comes to a little notification saying stop on your infotainment system, or shall I say instrument cluster, and means that you can still come to a complete standstill by initiating that left side flappy paddle, at least in the UK left hand side, on the minus sign basically. Now, of course, if you want to recoup energy at a much faster rate, you can of course plug it in, because it's an electric vehicle after all, and you've got a CCS port and a Type 2 port connected up to a 350 kilowatt charger, which will dispatch up to 220 to 225 kilowatts on the Ioniq 5. It means that you will go from 10 to 80% in just 18 minutes, which is absolutely sensational. If you go on a 50 kilowatt input instead, which are, well, a lot more common on the motorways, be it in Europe and or in the UK or around the world, here you'll see that time go up to around 1 hour. Now, of course, you do also have the Type 2 input, and here, if you're going from 0 to 100%, such as using a home or workplace charger, it'll take roughly 16 hours. You can bring that down if you are using a 3-phase power supply via, like, let's say, an 11 kilowatt or 22 kilowatt input, because here the Ioniq 5 has a 10.5 kilowatt onboard charger, which really does shave down the overall 0 to 100% time using such an input, versus versus a 7 kilowatt charger, because here it can take roughly 9 hours. So in comparison to 16 hours, it means that it's a lot more convenient. Of course, these are extreme figures from 0 to 100%. I don't suspect many people will doing that, but it's worth bearing in mind. Now, on the subject of chargers and connectors, in the Ioniq 5 Ultimate trim, you do have access to vehicle-to-load technology, that's V2L for short, and that means using an adapter, you can plug in a regular 3-pin appliance, such as, let's say, a kettle, and you can literally pop it on. I know, it's quite English or British to say the least, but in another practical sense, you can plug in a laptop, for example, or even if you want, you can also plug in another electric car. The only thing to be mindful over here is that you've got a 2.3 kilowatt input, 220 volts, and therefore it's going to take a substantial amount of time to charge another car. But nevertheless, I think it's a cool little inclusion. Now, inside the cabin, you do also have a 3-pin plug, so therefore that laptop charging, well, doesn't have to be done from outside the vehicle. You can do it within the car as well, which also makes it all that bit more convenient for your rear passengers. And finally, we get on to safety, and here the Ioniq 5 scored an impressive 5 out of 5 stars on Euro NCAP's rigorous crash tests. And while I can't exactly comment on crash testing myself, I can see from the video that it does well across the board. Actually, particularly did well in the safety assistance system, scoring 88%. Now, I did put the driver assistance systems to their paces, and I must say I am very much impressed with what Hyundai have offered over here. As standard, you have got smart cruise control, whereby it adjusts your speed and gives you start and go technology, meaning that if the car in front of you stops, it will stop and then resume in terms of the distance and in terms of the speed that you have selected. You have got lane keeping assistance, lane follow assistance, and therefore you've got that kind of semi-autonomous driving experience whereby it does the steering input for you when you are driving on the motorway, and it does get enabled each time you step inside the car, in other words when you start the vehicle, but you can easily disable this via a button found on the steering wheel, which is not the same thing that could be said about some of its competitors, whereby you have to faff around with the infotainment system. So it's nice to see that there is an easy way of disabling this each time you step a foot inside, and the reason it's enabled as standard is, from my understanding, it's one of Euro NCAP's methodologies, in other words one of their requirements in order to get that lane positioning assistance at all times. Now, elsewhere it should be mentioned you've got rear cross traffic alert, which gives you a little bit of peace of mind when you're pulling out of a place and therefore you might have not seen your blind spots. You have got the blind spot monitoring system, as I did reference before, although that is only present in the more expensive trims, and therefore it uses cameras on the left and right hand side in order to give you an indication of where your blind spot is. And then you've got a whole bunch of other safety assistance systems which might not be used as much. So for example, the driver attention warning, so it gives you an indication if you want to brake. You've got the leading car movement, in other words the assist here, so if the car in front of you goes away, it'll give you a little indication if you have taken your eyes off the road, and therefore tells you, oh, the car in front of you is gone, you might want to pull away before you getting honked from the rear. But anyway, suffice to say, Hyundai have done a phenomenal job across the board with its safety system and driver assistance systems, and it definitely should be commended in this department. And so this brings me on to my verdict. Would I recommend the Ioniq 5? Well, that truthfully depends on you. If you want something that's pretty unique in terms of its exterior design, it's pretty spacious in terms of its cabin and also its boot space, and you've got something that's pretty efficient in terms of its battery technology, then arguably the Ioniq 5 is the best for you. However, consider there's some alternatives out there. The Polestar 2 and the Tesla Model 3 are great saloon-based cars. In terms of the hatchback class, you've got the VW ID3, the Renault Zoe and the Nissan Leaf. As for the SUV class, because the Ioniq 5 also competes in this domain, you have got the Volvo XC40 Recharge Twin Pro, you've also got the Audi Q4 e-tron, and even to an extent the Mercedes EQA. Then you've also got the Kia e-Niro, the Kia Soul EV and the Hyundai Kona Electric. I do understand they're a little bit smaller vehicles, but they're fantastic alternatives, and if you just want to go all out large, you've got the Skoda Enyaq iV. Suffice to say, there are plenty of other alternatives and ones that we would recommend. They'll be all down in the description below, all the detailed reviews of them, and of course would be intrigued to hear your thoughts of the Ioniq 5, be it if you're looking to purchase it and or have already purchased it. Now, if you've liked this video and want to see more, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. And as such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.